Dan Sisson is with us, the author of The American Revolution of 1800. He's a distinguished professor of American history and the revolution coming our way at the Thom Hartmann University on the banks of the Potomac. He's an adjunct faculty member at Eastern Washington University, where he teaches the history of technology in the engineering department. And many thanks to them for bringing him to us by Skype. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Good to see you.
Thank you. We're up to Chapter 4 now in our analysis of your book, The American Revolution of 1800. And first of all, I'm curious if you see any parallels or concordance or contrast, for that matter, between the revolutionary era and the revolutionary spirit of the 1770s or of 1800, and I think it's revolutionary, as in overthrowing the established order behavior that we're seeing all across the United States now in support of Michael Brown and of support of changing our policing methods or the way that we police the police, and confronting the issues of institutional racism in the United States.
Well, I don't think there's any question that when you have a situation where people in authority are viewed with suspicion, when the institutions of society no longer function the way that they are supposed to, according to the principles of our system, you have discrimination, you have disenfranchisement, huge unemployment, all the rest, that is striking also the middle class in addition to the minorities, that you're going to have disaffection and you're going to have desperation. And I think that that's what we're beginning to see after, say, 30 years of policies which have led to this. And if you go back to the 1770s, these are the very conditions that produced the attitude that made revolution possible.
Yeah, the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre. I mean,
absolutely.
As I recall, at the Boston Massacre, only one guy was killed, right?
No, I think there's like 7 or 8.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
nevertheless?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that what we should view here is that local rebellions can sort of publicize the issues, and what that does, it expands. It's like dropping a bottle of ink into a barrel of clean water. This whole thing just suffuses throughout the society.
Right.
And there is a point in which you can't turn back, in which the establishment has lost all of its credibility. I mean, all you have to do is just look at the economic scene since 2008 to 2007 and realize that none of these bankers not one has gone to jail, and the whole justice system is now being called into question. People everywhere are doing this.
Yeah, so we're living in a revolutionary time now. In Chapter 4 of your book, The American Revolution of 1800, you are talking about the American versus the French Revolution's theory of revolution, as it were.
Right. And the reason I do that is because I feel that the contrast, especially in terms of expectations, revolution always involves expectations of freedom or liberty or a better life or whatever. And what we see is that the influence by the Americans on Europe at this time was simply an incredible expectation. And so when one of the leading countries of France goes into revolution about the rights of man, echoing our Declaration of Independence, all of a sudden you have people talking for the first time in their lives, maybe ever in the history of Europe, about how every man should have certain rights guaranteed. And it's your duty as well as your right to demand those rights. And this upends everything about the nature of European society. So this is something that Americans just assume as a birthright, and yet we see in our own time all these things, like when Bush instituted torture. There is nothing that I can think of that contradicts the principles of America than being the country that initiates torture the world over. We won't close Guantanamo Bay.
Right, it's a huge betrayal of our own principles.
Absolutely. And we can't get Americans to think about things like this and their revolutionary heritage unless we begin to think in terms of principles. Just looking at whether the president says something or whether the Senate says something is insufficient. We have to get down to something that's more basic and that involves us all.
Yeah.
And I think that principles is the way to do it.
Yeah. How did the principles contradict the form in the French Revolution and lead to disaster? The French Revolution ultimately, I guess ultimately you could say it was successful, but over the short term it led right to Maximilien Robespierre and the terrors and the guillotine and all this, which is not the outcome that certainly Thomas Paine was expecting when he went over there and got thrown in jail.
He got thrown in jail. They tried to come for him 2 or 3 times to put him in a guillotine.
Yeah.
And this is part of the problem. And this gets back to the first part of our book when we talk about faction and party. And when you start looking at what happened in France, first of all, if you could say compare it to America, we had the states. And the states were independent, sovereign entities when they came into the Articles of Confederation. People were attached to their regions and their localities, and they were used to electing local officials. When you go to France, by comparison, the provinces existed, and some of the representatives to the parliament were from the provinces. But the first thing that Robespierre did was to use the force of party and faction to destroy the what you might call the welling up of equality in those provinces through their representatives. And he sort of dismissed those people. And all of a sudden, you had all power concentrated in the hands of Robespierre and his faction. And then they start talking about how we have to have everything one and indivisible. Well, this is death to a revolution, because it means that the people who are out there in the countryside, in the provinces, or in our case, the states, are just simply cut out from any authority. I mean, does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Isn't there a fear about the federal government being able to go to war whenever it wants to, not consulting our representatives, not consulting the states, the fear of money pervading our system so that it shortcuts all of these people that we elect in good faith, but they're bought off? I mean, this has now become so recognizable that I think it's like an acid that is undermining the basic principles of America. And we've got to reverse this if America is going to survive.
Yeah. And I think the people in the streets right now are saying that. Yeah.
I think so. In their own way, yeah.
Yeah. Jefferson's final thoughts on the cause of the failure of the revolution in France?
Well, I think that those final thoughts are that Jefferson saw what can happen if you allow faction and party to become paramount in any political movement. Jefferson's one who said, if you're going to attain liberty, it has to be by degrees. It's got to be slow but sure, and that we can't get everything all at once. You can't concentrate everything in one small group of people. And after Occupy movement in New York last year, one of the things I'm hearing from some of the people that were involved is, we've got to have a party that can concentrate power, and they're using, examples of permanent revolutionaries like Lenin and others. This is not the American tradition of revolution. If you look at America, you're talking about basically a conservative nation, and it's not going to go up.
Conservative, not in the way that Fox News would characterize it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're very much a liberal nation in that context. But you mean in terms of just slow incremental change over hundreds of years?
That's right. Our institutions.
Yeah, of institutions. Dan Sisson, his book, The American Revolution of 1800. You can find it in your favorite bookstore. It is just recently out. Co-author Thom Hartmann. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
The American Revolution of 1800 by Dan Sisson, Sisson. And welcome back, Dan. You're still with us?
Sure am.
Okay, great. I'd like to squeeze another 5 minutes out of this conversation if I can. Yeah, but I've gone through the questions that we talked about. Where for Chapter 4, what would you say is the main arc of Chapter 4, and how is it relevant to today without being redundant or too redundant?
Well, I think the main ideas of Chapter 4 is that we have to make a connection between form and principle in our society. And if we don't think both in terms of form and principle, then we are likely to lose our institutions or the ideas that make them viable and protect things like our rights. And
so can I make a modern day comparison? The form that the grand jury did in Missouri with regard to the Michael Brown shooting, the form was a legal process that should produce truth, right? But the process actually wasn't. The process was badly corrupted by the prosecutor's relationship with the police department, which is an entirely natural thing. I mean, his job depends on the police department. And so because of the principle of examining crimes regardless of who committed them,
right,
the form that we used to execute that principle failed. Am I making sense here? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, let me just phrase it in a slightly different way. The grand jury investigation is something that even Jefferson was proud of, that America had within its legal system. But the grand jury investigation is supposed to be operated by a prosecutor, and they're always looking, for the evidence of guilt. And what we see here is the reverse of this principle, in that the prosecuting attorney who was in charge of the investigation acted more like a defense attorney.
Right.
And so here we are. The guy's not indicted. The evidence is conflicting that's been put out. There are all kinds of witnesses. We don't know if anybody's even been cross-examined. I mean, there's all kinds of what you might call suspensions of the normal protections that citizens should receive under the system. And that the principle is that we are guaranteed these things. We have the right to originate legislation. Nobody can take that away from us. And so basically, all across America, when you have these situations, we're seeing the establishment protecting itself.
Right.
And when we think about protesters, I think the protesters should be given equal protection whenever the military or the police or anybody else are called in. And what we have is a sense that that principle is not maintained, that we're protecting property, we're protecting the buildings or the businesses. That's what's emphasized.
Right.
And we've got to get back to a point where we start, claiming our rights.
Right. And that's what's being shown in the news with all this riot porn that we're seeing, rather than pictures of a dead kid on the street, which really should be the topic.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Remarkable stuff. Absolutely remarkable stuff. Dan Sisson, you've written a brilliant book, The American Revolution of 1800, and I commend it to everybody. It's a great holiday gift. And Dan, thanks for being with us today.
You're sure welcome, Tom.
And please give our very best to everybody at the university there who helped make it possible.
All right. Yeah.